overall, from the Hamas-controlled Gaza health ministry, the death toll is over 18,000. Now that's an extraordinary number considering we're not even 10 weeks into this military campaign.
Right.
It's already one of the deadliest military operations this century. So this really has been a very significant death toll in Gaza. And so this is something the U.S. has talked about for weeks now, that they are imploring the Israelis to do more to prevent civilian loss. And yet we still haven't quite seen these pleas turn into actual action. We haven't seen Israel do much different than they had been doing previously.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, let's talk a little bit about the status of the war in Gaza. What's the latest?
At this moment, we've seen a lot of Israeli continued operations, both in the north, but now primarily in the south. And we've also started to see a little bit of daylight start to emerge between how Israel is carrying out their operations and what the U.S. wants. And now, obviously, the U.S. is Israel's biggest supporter and has remained by its side since October 7th, in spite of a lot of international condemnation in how they're carrying out the attacks. There have been two real big sort of disputes that we've seen play out so far. The first being the continued rise in the civilian death toll in Gaza. Now, overall, from the Hamas-controlled Gaza health ministry, the death toll is over 18,000. Now that's an extraordinary number considering we're not even 10 weeks into this military campaign.
Right.
It's already one of the deadliest military operations this century. So this really has been a very significant death toll in Gaza. And so this is something the U.S. has talked about for weeks now, that they are imploring the Israelis to do more to prevent civilian loss. And yet we still haven't quite seen these pleas turn into actual action. We haven't seen Israel do much different than they had been doing previously. So that's number one. And number two, the other big difference is there's a disagreement between Israel and the U.S. in the what happens next phase of the conflict. And so the U.S. and the Biden administration have pushed for what they see as a renewed and revitalized Palestinian Authority to take over control of Gaza, and they're currently leading the West Bank. They're also not a particularly popular government in the West Bank alone, and so we've seen Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other Israeli officials say that that's not happening. And so there really is a dispute as to what happens next when this war inevitably comes to an end.
So it puts President Biden, I think, in a little bit of a difficult position, doesn't it? Because he's been getting a lot of criticism from progressives in his own party for not putting enough pressure on Israel to avoid civilian casualties, but he's also getting a lot of criticism from Republicans who say he's not doing enough to support Israel.
He's in a very tough situation. He is trying to do a balancing act. Not only is he facing criticism from people in his own party about not doing enough for Israel or not conditioning military aid to Israel, which has been a big sticking point, but we're also seeing Arab leaders around the world condemn the U.S. for their continued support of Israel, whether that's expressed through the UN or in terms of sentiment across the globe. And so the president is in this difficult position where he's always been a strong backer of Israel, continues to be, but the images coming out of Gaza are just horrific, and it shows the level of destruction and death that's currently going on in the Middle East.
So another area where President Biden is sort of getting pulled around and is under a lot of pressure is Ukraine, where he's trying to get a Ukraine aid package out of Congress so that they can keep supporting the war effort against Russia. What's the status of those talks at this point?
They're not. The administration is not overly optimistic. We haven't seen much progress in these negotiations. We have Republicans who are dead set on making sure that there is support or money for border security in any sort of supplemental package, while we hear from administration officials and Democrats that this package can't wait. And so this has gone on for a couple of weeks now, these negotiations, and yet it doesn't look like they'll be able to pass anything before the end of the calendar year. And so that is a very significant factor for Ukraine in particular, because the U.S. has a much smaller amount of money currently allocated for military aid to go to Ukraine. And so that is continuing to dwindle as the U.S. continues to provide them aid, with no clear sense of whether or not that sort of fund will be refilled by Congress. And so we've seen the Pentagon both slow the amount of their military aid, or slow the frequency of their military aid, as well as the amount. And it's because they're not sure that more's coming. And that's a pretty big deal, considering Ukraine has, essentially for the most part, through almost 2 years of war, forced a stalemate, which was something that was not expected at all at the beginning of the war. And so there are concerns about what could happen if if the U.S. doesn't continue to support Ukraine. And then the other aspect is, we heard this week in newly declassified intelligence that Russia's lost over 300,000 men in the war, or soldiers in the war. The loss is extraordinary, considering they only had about 360,000 prepared at the start of the conflict. Now they've recruited more soldiers, even being desperate enough to go to prisons and exchange a willingness to fight for their freedom of prisoners. So it really does show that Ukraine has done an extraordinary job in keeping the fight alive and degrading the Russian military, which is something the U.S. is obviously supportive of, especially when it doesn't involve U.S. troops on the line.
So if Israel and Ukraine weren't enough problems to be facing in the world, we now are looking at the Red Sea as a trouble spot, and obviously with the ongoing hostilities in Yemen. What's going on right now?
So the Houthi rebels in Yemen, who have Iranian support, which at the end I'll tie it back in, Iran supports all of these problematic actors. The Houthis have been targeting commercial vessels in the Red Sea and other nearby bodies of water, whom they say have connections to Israel, because they're doing this trying to convince Israel to stop its war in Gaza. And so they are attacking commercial vessels that are, these are not warships. These are commercial vessels that are being attacked either by drones or by missiles that are fired at it. And then both the U.S. and France have increased their naval presences in the area and are responding to distress calls from these attacked ships. And so this is continuing to be a problem as these attacks continue to happen. And so between the Houthis, Hamas, and Russia, all three of them have varying relationships with Tehran, and they all have, stances against the U.S. And the whatever the U.S. mission is, or U.S. stances in that conflict. And so it really shows the extent.
And they've all gotten some level of support from Iran.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so whether that's the drones that Iran has provided to Russia, or the weapons Iran provides to Hamas or even Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as the Houthis, as well as proxies in Syria and Iraq, which are also attacking U.S. forces in those countries. Iran has their fingers in a number of different smaller conflicts that show a larger picture of the U.S. against Iran.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.